Hey, U.S. Sister students, it's Mr. Baker with you again. Hope you're doing well. We're about ready to dive into another element or area, if you will, of the 1960s. And that area is what we call the time of 60s activism. So I want to bring to your attention just a couple of things to really think about as we look at this issue for the next few class periods. And the first thing is that when a lot of people think of the 60s, they think of counterculture, the hippie movement. And what I want us to be able to do, guys, is to think about how does some of the behavior, some of the approaches to life, if you will, of a lot of younger youth, teenagers, older people, etc. How's that going to impact the 60s culture? Okay. And we say that we're talking about a very broad area. It could be, the idea of going to college and doing all these different things that we associate with a lot of the things. Okay. What issues did the youth feel strongly about? Okay. And also commit themselves to moving ourselves forward. Okay. We started to look at that a little bit in the 50s, where we kind of looked at kind of the surfacing of the use of this term teenager and how, there's certain stereotypes. What do teenagers, like to bring up to the table as far as their ideas and their thoughts? Well, a lot of that is going to be kind of a continuation from 50s with the beat era or the beatnik culture. Okay. There is going to be, some emphasis on things like pop culture, some of the elements that we won't go into too much detail with the sexual revolution side of the 60s, with some of the things with, just kind of branching out with certain behavior that maybe was seen as more taboo or risque before. Now it's becoming something that's a bit more, I guess, maybe not just acceptable by some people's standards, but certainly even you're going to have people that have significant contrast with it. Okay. And then we're going to look briefly at a couple other things, the civil rights issues that are affecting Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, and then also kind of a carryover from World War II to an extent as well, the impact it's eventually going to have on Japanese Americans. And then last but not least, for sure, we're going to look at a couple of other areas before tomorrow. We focus more of our attention on feminism, and that's going to be the idea of consumer protection and also, of course, environmental protection. Those are not new movements. If you think back to like the likes of people like Upton Sinclair and even the protection of the environment with Theodore Roosevelt with his conservation focus, what I think these movements do is they kind of move us into a more modern direction. Okay, the question is, how do all these things get attention? Well, to a large extent, it's people, right? The idea that people are going to write things and make themselves more, shall we say, public and noticeable, and therefore, they start to have people reading their works, whether they're written in the sense of novels or books, or even the idea of magazine articles. All right, so it's a lot like muckrakers, maybe in a different way. So the question is, guys, where do we go from here when it comes to the idea of this counterculture? Well, kind of a fun little quote here that some people, you see the flower power emphasis there, the peace sign. A student of mine passed it on to me a few years ago. If you can remember the 60s, you weren't really there. Now, whether or not that's completely 100% true, obviously there's a lot of debate there, but there's a video here that we're not going to watch in this session today, but will be posted for you on Canvas, that you can actually look at it, and it includes some of the elements of the 60s and the drugs, the rock and roll, things like that. I would argue, however, and some of you have heard me say this before, we need to be very mindful of putting the counterculture into almost like a box, or shall we say a stereotype, because they really did advocate for a lot of things that I think deserve a lot of credit. All right, we'll come back to that on our next slide. But if you're kind of wondering what is a really good basic nuts and bolts working definition of counterculture, really what you're looking at is a group of young Americans. All right, so you're talking about probably mid to late teens, anywhere into probably 20s, early 30s perhaps, who rejected conventional customs as well as mainstream culture. Okay, so a way to think about this, if you go back to the beatniks in the 50s, again, another kind of like reference, some context here, is that, guys, if you think about it, a lot of the youth were trying to kind of get away from what my mom does, what my dad does, what my family does, my grandparents, and they're wanting to kind of define, shall we say, culture on their own terms. Okay. And so they don't want to be like the previous generation. Okay. And so what you notice, guys, is that this is, of course, going to bring about some potential conflict and some culture wars about even music patterns and things that we'll look at in a second. Okay. So if you think about it, you're going to see the rise of a lot of students. We call this the rise of the student movement. Okay. And so you're going to see, again, a lot of different groups popping up, right? Think back to, excuse me, the civil rights movement that we looked at with even like SNCC, et cetera. Well, these movements are going to be very much not exact, but very similar in regards to how they organize ideas, the way that they come together to promote things. And in the case of the student movement, guys, if you look at my cursor here, you'll notice one of the bigger, more influential organizations or groups is going to be what we call the SDS. That stands for Students for a Democratic Society. Now, if you're kind of wondering what is the purpose of the left-hand side and the right-hand side, I'm going to get to here in a second. But this is where I'm getting at, guys. We do not want to just associate the counterculture and some of the things in the 60s with, the three, ideas that usually come up: sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Now, is there some reference there? Sure. All right. But what I want you to really take from this, guys, is that these people were also very committed to the cause of trying to improve or reform or even make society better. Okay. So take a moment, guys, just pause for just a second. And I want you to take a quick look at what stands out to you about the kinds of issues that both the left-hand side and the right-hand side actually have as things that they basically want to address. Think for that in a moment, and I'll be back with you in just a moment to kind of further our discussion on this. All right, you have a chance to look. Some of these things should look pretty familiar. Civil rights, equality, economic justice. All right, all of those things in their own way relate strongly back to the civil rights movement, whether you're looking at African-American civil rights, women, etc. Peace in Vietnam, right? So guys, we haven't really talked extensively about the Vietnam War. That is coming soon. But the idea of universities being a place of ideas and thoughts, and the idea of, people being able to use amendment rights like free speech, press, assembly, of course, petition, etc. Okay, participatory democracy. Now, guys, if you think about what we're looking at there, think about the kinds of amendments that we've seen added to our Constitution already. We've seen the 15th Amendment adding suffrage for mostly minority men. We've seen the 19th Amendment extending suffrage, of course, to women. The question is, what group constitutionally at the federal level have we not really seen a lot of emphasis on? Yeah, age. So this kind of comes back to one of the arguments in the case of war and the selective service and basically the draft and serving your country. If you're in a position to basically be drafted, called into battle, called into duty, what's to say that you should not be able to have a direct, or at least a somewhat direct influence in voting to actually have a voice and influence, et cetera, with policy? Now, policy is a word that kind of can get a little bit stuffy headed, but the nuts and bolts, guys, of policy is government is making decisions, passing laws, basically doing things that basically elected officials are making decisions about. And the argument is that if you're in a position to serve the country abroad, that you should also have that kind of voice and influence. Okay. I won't spend too much time on the other four things: environment, housing. Housing is also something that, if you take a look at a lot of things related to civil rights, healthcare, and also, of course, education. If you're kind of wondering, all right, we see what the SDS is advocating for in the 1960s. What's the whole point in the present? My fellow North Carolinians might find this interesting. About 10 or so years ago, I was doing a little bit of research. How do university campus still reflect these things? This is actually an agenda from one of the SDS branches that was at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Now, keep in mind, this has changed over time, but if you take a look at it, guys, it's very, very closely centered around a lot of very similar kinds of things. Okay, so I don't know if you need to memorize every single one of these verbatim and in order, but we definitely need to understand that this youth movement and this counterculture in that respect too are really moving us forward and supporting change and progress in ways that goes beyond some of the basic stereotypes that we associate with them. Okay, now with that being said, we also notice clashes as far as music. Now, a lot of you are, maybe you've heard of the Beatles. Most of you, I think, are probably maybe even folks that have listened to their songs before. Maybe, if y'all have a favorite song, Yellow Submarine to me is pretty cool. Can't Buy Me Love, etc. But as you can see there, the British Invasion, Beatles, The Who, The Kinks, which is another band that I like quite a bit. All right. And then also, of course, the Rolling Stones. They're all going to kind of transition this form of music into American pop culture. Okay. Now, it's not to say that Americans don't have bands of their own. We certainly do. You see the rise of bands like The Doors, Jimi Hendrix, etc. But where this is important is if you want to watch this clip later on, a lot of you may have heard of like late night TV talk shows, things like that. Well, there was a gentleman by the name of Ed Sullivan who actually was kind of like this late night talk show guy. And if you really wanted to get very, shall we say, kind of like publicized as far as like mainstream people really getting exposed to your work, then Ed Sullivan was a common show. There's about a 13-minute clip that you can actually watch bits and pieces of it, of one of the, I think it was 3 times, at least in 1 year of the earlier 60s, that the Beatles actually were there. And if those of you that watch it, it's kind of fun to pay attention to the audience responses, especially some of the young ladies. I remember my mom and my aunts, my students may have heard me tell the story where, their father was, not really on board with the Beatles guy, didn't like their music, thought that their hair was different, their dress was different. And so, they had to kind of get around their parents' rules, kind of like a form of protest, but doing it in a nonviolent way for sure, where they would actually wait up, they would have somebody on guard. Because remember back then, you only got really about 1 television set per family, maybe 2 if you were fortunate. And so they would actually kind of be on the lookout if, there was any, hey, mom's coming, and they would turn the channel, no flipping the channel, as in, the idea of remote controls. And so this is a big element that kind of brings us into this movement. Do any of you know what this is? Okay. If you said Woodstock, you are correct. A huge concert in New York, 1969, a flowering of culture, the culture of the hippies, etc. A lot of music, a lot of really interesting things. And why is that a big deal? It became almost like an icon of some of the things that we're talking about. Okay. Kind of a fun thing to think about is the slang or the language that the counterculture kind of introduced to the American people. I want you all to take just a moment to look at this list and ask yourself the question, which one of those terms might be perhaps the most used in our society today, whether it's you all or your parents or maybe even your grandparents. And I'll share a quick story with that with you all as you have time to reflect on that. So just take a few moments to do that. Okay, U.S. history students, do any of those stand out to you? I'm sure all of you, whether it's in movies, songs, maybe even conversations with others, have actually came across these. I probably heard the majority of these when I was y'all's age. I was 16 in the early 90s. But I remember my mom always used to use the word neato. And my generation, Generation X, I think they refer to us as, we would always say neato Frito. And my mom would just look at us like, really? You're saying that? But again, it's kind of a continuation of culture from the past to give almost like your own sense of identity to it. Okay. So kind of a fun little thing to get you thinking about how language, culture, et cetera, kind of endures over the course of time. Now, something to also think about with this brings us back to something that we're going to spend just a few minutes on, and that is the sexual revolution. All right. The idea of the rise of things like sexual orientation with gay and lesbian movements to really advocate for the idea of openness and things like that. The picture here, if you take a look, is a symbol of that. Okay. You go into some towns that are a bit more progressive in their thinking, like for example, Asheville, North Carolina, which is a fairly artsy area. It's not that uncommon in downtown Asheville for you to see like businesses and restaurants and basically downtown areas that actually have this as a symbol. Okay. And it's a symbol of more openness along the lines of gay and lesbian pride, et cetera, et cetera. So you notice those kinds of things kind of moving us forward. You also notice in the 60s the relaxation of censorship laws. And this is not just unique to the 60s, but again, guys, a clash in culture wars. If you think about it, censorship could be things like visual things, like when I was probably 5 in 1980, again, a little bit down the line, the idea of Daisy Duke shorts was controversial, right? You didn't see a lot of negative words and the Dukes of Hazzard and things like that. But you had this clash between different groups about looking at it from, is that appropriate for certain age groups? And therefore you have all these, different views about, censorship, what time, even as far as television and even radio programs, et cetera, should you actually have certain programs on the air in case children were to actually be up watching them? Okay. And so this is going to become a bigger thing moving into the 60s. And then, of course, the idea, guys, of women kind of, again, having a lot of views about them. And we'll look at this more with feminism tomorrow. The idea of, technology, right to privacy, the idea of birth control. We looked at that in the 20s, guys, if you remember Margaret Sanger. Well, by the 1960s, technology has developed so far along that you have even emphasis on the birth control pill, right, as a way of course, contraception and restricting births and pregnancies and things like that. Okay, even the idea of double standards for men and women when it comes to social behavior is something that, of course, gets a lot of attention during this time. Okay. And then, of course, those of you that like art, I thought I'd throw this in there. The idea of pop art. If you've heard of like Andy Warhol, my wife is from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. There's a lot of emphasis there with him. This very, bold kind of artist. This is basically going to be, you'll notice that Warhol is not the only name, but it's probably the one that probably most of you have heard of more so than Max and also Lichtenstein. Okay. But as you can see here, what really defines pop art, iconic things, well-known people. I don't have this there, but if you've ever seen the picture of Marilyn Monroe and the different colors in Mao Zedong, that's basically a Warhol painting. And as you can see there, even the Statue of Liberty and also the Campbell Soup label. Now, what this does, guys, if you think about it, is it brings attention to the fact that we also have other issues and other areas of our society that need to further make progress. We spent quite a bit of time last week on the civil rights movement. What we notice is that movements to support the rights of Hispanics, Chicano movement, the idea of Cesar Chavez, that's his picture, by the way, in the upper picture there that I have the cursor on. He is going to be extremely important to the idea of moving forward, especially protecting workers. Okay. The United Farm Workers, the UFW, as it became known as an abbreviation, is going to be really important to protect farm laborers, especially out in parts of California. Okay. And Chavez is extremely essential with that. So again, think about things like people, leadership, goals. The ultimate goal of Cesar Chavez is to basically make it to where wages, workplace safety, conditions are more supported. And he was also, guys, you could put him in the category of very similar to Martin Luther King Jr. in the respect that he did believe in things like boycotts and nonviolent forms of protest, to actually get his point across. The American Indian movement, you'll notice that these two little indicators there, whatever you want to call those, they're going to really kind of promote the idea of trying to bring attention to the atrocities and some of the things that have happened, like Trail of Tears, 1890, guys, if you remember, was one of the really big things, the Battle of Wounded Knee, that eventually is going to be pretty much the tail end of the Native American Wars. And in a sense, what they're trying to do is really kind of develop this sense of, you could say pride, but there's a little bit more to it than that as well. And then last but not least, if you think back to World War II, what was the thing that happened to the Japanese Americans? The internment camps. Okay. And the stigma with that, some of the problems that have came up with that have not gone away. Okay. So the Japanese American Citizens League is going to be really very outspoken. Guys, in the late 80s, when I was, I think, in middle school, 1980, I believe it was, the Congress eventually says, you know what, we're going to acknowledge that we pretty much treated this not the right way. And so you notice like compensation that's going to be given to the people that were still alive. Right? I think that was the tail end of Reagan's second term when that happened. Okay. So if you think about it, what else is going to lead us, guys, into this latter bit of 60s activism? Well, two things: consumer protection and also the idea of an environment. And I actually flip-flop those in that order in the slides. Now, think about what we've said about most movements. You've got leadership, people, ways that we're kind of exposed to ideas that need to be overcome. Well, guys, in these two movements, it's no different. Okay, so Rachel Carson, who's going to write a famous book called Silent Spring in 1966, I believe it was, is going to make it really, really clear, is going to make it really, really clear that there's some things that we're doing to our environment that need to be given one, attention, and two, change. If you go back and you think about muckrakers like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle and immediate government responding, this is a very similar kind of thing. Okay, you can make a strong argument, guys, that her book is kind of like the signature thing that kind of revamps or kind of jumpstarts again this idea of, the need for an environmentalist movement. Okay, now I want to talk about this a little bit when we get in our whole class session if you can attend, but think about, guys, how the environment plays into the political structure of campaigns today. All right, meaning, you've got to focus on this. How many voters, would put like the environment as a top echelon issue when it comes to selecting a candidate? Okay, well, not to say that people didn't care about the environment before this, but they're certainly going to start to take more notice of it as time moves on. The big thing, guys, that she focuses on exclusively in this book is the bad effects of DDT. And at the end of the day, if you kind of want to summarize the big picture of her book that she's trying to bring the attention to people, this is pretty much what it is in a nutshell. This is really the thesis of it. Human beings, in other words, you and I, are part of nature. Every time we walk outside, into our backyard, into a forest, into any area that has natural habitat to it, we're basically interacting with nature. And as a result, we as humans, this is a big underlining part of her book, guys, and her philosophy, is we have a responsibility for the health of nature, right? Affecting the ecosystems, etc. As you can imagine, people read the book, they wanted action. The result of that is you have the creation of what's called the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. You also have a couple of what I call landmark pieces of legislation in the Clean Water and Clean Air Acts. These might be worth to kind of take a few notes on. And then also you have even throwing in there, guys, as far as like the idea of protecting workplace, the idea of OSHA standards for workplace safety. Okay, just a quick personal note. I've been in education for about 22, almost 23 years. I did have a point where I actually did a side job for a company, I won't mention specific names of it, that actually produced film paper. And I remember, first week or two on the job, we're learning all these different things about how to make film paper. And we worked in the part of the company that actually put all the chemicals together so they could coat it. Basically, we found out that we were told by our trainer that, there's certain protocols that you have to go through when disposing of waste outside. And they said, you have to always, at least the potential, the protocol was you actually had to sign off whenever you would, do like a dispersal of some of the chemicals from outside or inside to outside. And they said that one of the EPA standards was basically fines. If you one of the penalties of violating EPA standards was basically, you're penalized. You were basically fined, and this was back in the late '90s. And what I learned was that if you were to do that without actually double checking to make sure that it wasn't contaminating, I think if I recall correctly, the fine was like a $50,000 fine. Okay, so guys, imagine how much emphasis there is moving forward with these kinds of things. Okay, the water that we drink, the water that we use when we basically, maybe have a swimming pool to swim in, even those of you that like to go to lakes and even, of course, the oceans and things, we are definitely going to, I think, benefit from some of these policies. But it takes action, and it also takes a lot of what I like to call hard work. Last but not least, consumer protection. Think about what you already know about things like the FDA, the idea of when you walk into a store, you've got all these different things. Those of you that like to buy meat, you've got a lot of these different things that tell us weight and fat content and even calorie content. Well, guess what? You have another major figure that pops up, obviously after Upton Sinclair. His name is Ralph Nader. I'll be very impressed if y'all know anything about him, but basically, a lot of you might know this, might not. He's ran for president several times. He's quite a bit older now. His claim to fame was not running for president at first. It was actually one of his biggest contributions was to consumer protection. And he wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed. Can you guess what that book maybe dealt with? You're right. The car industry. Okay. And so what this guy does is he does kind of like an investigative amount of research, and then also his book. And guys, for the most part, he comes to this big conclusion that, car safety, the way that we're producing cars, whether that's emissions, crash test, things, which is a big thing that's kind of a result of his work. Cars are not basically safe. And guys, as you can see here, he goes as far to say that cars are quote unquote coffins on what? You got it, wheels. Now y'all can look into that and decide, is he right? Is he kind of taking this a step too far? But guys, at the end of the day, in the mid 60s, as you can see, Congress hears from him directly. He goes in front of them. He basically gives his testimony, if you will. And basically what you start to notice, furthering of some of these things. If you're in the class lesson today and we have time, we might try to branch out on this a little more. But guys, if you think about it, there's going to be a lot more laws. I can recall, you all cannot, your parents, you could ask them about this, grandparents as well. But I don't remember having to put on a seatbelt until I was in middle school per Ohio law. Okay. But it doesn't just go there. You've got things like baby food, insecticides, the whole 9 yards. So where do we wrap this up? Well, the big picture is you've got all these areas of activism that are impacting the way that we go about moving through the 60s to try to better society. And if you think about it, guys, politicians have a role with this. The public have a role with this. And of course, the people in general that are not even voters, like you all's age group, could easily, guys, have been involved in quite a few of these potential areas of activism. Okay, I want you to think about that. I want you to also kind of put a little bit of food for thought into the feminism side of this, because we haven't talked about that extensively, but tomorrow we will. And email me with any questions. And I want y'all to really talk with your families. We're getting to a point in history where you can actually have conversations with people on the history that we're studying. And I want you to maybe ask them, and about using 60s, slang, maybe some of the things that they might know about some of the activism that we're talking about, and if you're comfortable sharing. Have a good one. I look forward to seeing you next time, and take care. Bye-bye.